Mesdames, Messieurs, soyez les bienvenus dans cette nouvelle rencontre. Nous avons l'immense plaisir aujourd'hui, dans le cadre de Espoir et Dignité, avec notre partenaire aussi in two minutes, de recevoir Dr Alena Douhan. Dr Alena Douhan, c'est le rapporteur spécial auprès de la Commission internationale des droits de l'homme sur l'impact négatif des mesures coercitives unilatérales sur la jouissance des droits de l'homme. Cette rencontre va être en français avec traduction. C'est notre frère de Into Mins, Erwan et Maurice vont assurer la traduction. Ils vont assurer aussi la gestion de cette rencontre avec moi. Madame Douhan, merci infiniment d'avoir accepté notre invitation.
It was a pleasure.
Merci beaucoup. Madame Douhan, j'aimerais bien commencer avec vous en vous demandant de présenter votre mission en tant que rapporteur spécial sur les impacts négatifs des mesures coercitives unilatérales, sur les sanctions unilatérales sur les droits de l'homme. Est-ce que je commence d'abord, Maurice, il traduit, puis Antoine, oui.
So, we would like to start to ask you about your mission as it's related to sanctions, international sanctions.
Well, the mandate of the Special Rapporteur on the negative impact of on unilateral coercive measures on human rights has been established in 2015, and it's not focusing on international sanctions. It's focusing on sanctions which are adopted by states or regional organizations without a beyond authorization of the UN Security Council. The purpose of the mandate is to assess how these types of sanctions, as well as currently that is becoming even more important, the means to enforce these sanctions and over compliance with sanctions, is affecting human rights worldwide. So as a special rapporteur, I'm doing thematic reports on specific topics which I believe are the most important in this sphere. Like, for example, this year I worked to develop the sanctions monitoring tool to establish the instrument to assess the impact of sanctions worldwide. I also assess the impact of unilateral sanctions on access to justice. Last year, the focus was on the impact to the right to health, and the impact of unilateral sanctions means of the enforcement on over-compliance on human rights. Shall we make breaches for interpretation, or?
Sorry,
shall we make some sort of pauses for interpretation, or shall I just continue?
I mean, I would suggest that we do the interview in English, and then after we can do the editing for the...
Okay, fine for me.
With the translations, it'll be more fluid, and it would save time also.
Okay, good. So the second part of work is doing the country visits. During the period of my mandate, and I have been appointed in March 2020, I did 6 country visits. So it was Qatar, Venezuela, Zimbabwe, Iran, Syria, and recently China. To assess the impact of sanctions, and naturally it's always specific depending on the country and the scope of sanctions imposed, to the human rights on the ground, the spillover effect over the cross-border effect, and sometimes even the effect on the human rights in the countries which impose sanctions. I also prepare a report. The report on country visits is presented to the Human Rights Council. Thematic reports, also one is presented to the Human Rights Council session. The second one is presented to the UN General Assembly. Beside that, I deal with individual communications. So basically individuals, so companies can submit a complaint to the mandate, and if the complaint and information fits within the scope of the mandate, I can proceed and address any stakeholder. That means states or, for example, international organizations or businesses, and to receive the response. So basically communications go through the UN system, we receive official responses, everything is available on the web page of the mandate. At the same time, when it comes to another element of work of the special rapporteurs, is the part of the work is raising awareness of the mandate, and that's what is happening right now. I'm doing interviews, I participate in conferences, I do press conferences. Beside that, I can do other types of activities which are necessary to advance the mandate, and I believe, for example, that it's necessary to have a dialogue on the assessment of legality of various types of sanctions. As a law professor, I'm always very much in favor in finding the legal solutions for the problems or the judicial solutions for the problems. And I also believe that scholars shall have an impact in this sphere and shall be involved in the dialogue. That's one of the projects which is already I can't say accomplished because it's a living project, but it has already been launched, the Sanctions Research Platform, providing for the possibility to submit information about the legal research. And basically, we're talking about the articles or reports already prepared in 6 UN languages to the same platform to enable people to get access to this information and to encourage them to continue to do the research. Same for non-governmental organizations and international organizations. Currently, beside the establishment of the sanctions monitoring tool, which if we manage to do it properly, will be a living mechanism available from the webpage of the mandate. There's a specific application allowing people, NGOs, and states to submit information, which we will reflect as concern the impact of sanctions to every country. The mandate is currently working on the development of the document, the guiding principles on sanctions, business, and human rights. There is a public call for contributions on the webpage of the mandate, but the work itself has already lasted for 2 years. So I hope that the next November, we will have a huge conference to discuss the document and commentary to the document, which are basically the document is ready and the commentary is being finalized right now.
Thank you, Alena. Perhaps a good way to start these discussions about sanctions, at least for me, is can you provide us with a definition of what sanctions are? I tried looking at this when I was preparing the interview, and it's kind of challenging, right, to have some sort of consensus on what are sanctions, who they should be applied on, what's the international law saying about it. So can you help us untangle some of that complexity here?
Well, I believe your question is one of the most controversial and most complicated in this sphere. Eventually, when we look at the Charter of the United Nations, it doesn't have term sanctions. So basically, eventually, no one knows what we're talking about when we're talking about sanctions, but I'm trying to provide some sort of the outline from the point of international law. And first of all, it's necessary to say that when we're talking about sanctions, the definition quite often is political, not legal. So the Charter of the United Nations talks about the enforcement measures by the UN Security Council. But people like the term sanctions, and that's why it's used very frequently. So from the point of law, there are some types of activity which is allowed. So one characteristic of sanctions is that a means of pressure. But as we understand, the means of pressure can be legal and they can be illegal. So under international law, any means of pressure, both military and non-military, taken by the UN Security Council when acting under Chapter 7 of the UN Charter, that means in the situation of the breach of peace, threat to peace, or an act of aggression, they are legal. So if the UN Security Council decides on these measures, there is the obligation on the side of states to implement these measures strictly within the scope of the authorization they received from the UN Security Council. So all measures which will be within the scope of these authorizations will be legal. However, quite often, states might decide that we are working beyond authorization of the UN Security Council. For example, the UN Security Council designates 3 individuals, and the state referring to the same resolution designates 1,000 of them. So in this case, 997 individuals will be designated without authorization. So it will not be legal from the point of law. There are two other types of activity when the states apply some sort of pressure, but at the same time it's legal. One type is when state applies so-called unfriendly acts, but which do not violate any international obligation of a state. For example, one state doesn't like the behavior of another state, and it decides to minimize diplomatic presence and say we will have only 3 diplomatic agents in the country instead of 50. It makes functioning of diplomatic missions very complicated. It establishes problems with getting visas, might be, or a state may decide to close diplomatic office in the country and people will have to travel abroad to get visa. It's very unfriendly, it has a negative impact, but it is legal. So basically, these measures are unfriendly means of pressure, however, legal means, so we cannot qualify that as unilateral coercive measures. And my mandate is about unilateral coercive measures. Then there is another element when, for example, a state behaves with violation of international obligations, but the wrongfulness of behavior can be excluded due to the reference to countermeasures, for example. That means that if one state violates international obligations towards another state can do the same in response. However, in accordance with the law of international responsibility, there are serious limitations. It shall be done only by the victim states, so the state which is directly affected by the violation. It shall be done proportionally to the violation happening. It shall not affect fundamental human rights and shall not violate peremptory norms of international law. So basically, if we start with the presumption that all unfriendly acts are sanctions, if we reduce from that scope measures taken to enforce measures of the UN Security Council directly, if we exclude unfriendly but legal acts, retortions, and if we exclude the small part which might be qualified as countermeasures, all the rest is illegal. So when we talk about the unilateral sanctions, I would say that around 99% of them are unilateral coercive measures and they are illegal from the point of law. And we need to keep in mind that when we're talking about respect to international law, we're talking not about human rights obligations only. We're talking about obligations in the sphere of trade, in the sphere of treaties of amities, treaties of protection of investment, the Chicago Convention on Civil Aviation, the Convention on the Law of the Sea, all types of international treaties in all areas of international law.
So am I correct in understanding
that... Radwan, j'aimerais savoir quelque chose, Madame Douhan, s'il vous plaît, en tant que rapporteur spécial. Est-ce que vous pensez qu'aujourd'hui, votre mission est fiable pour diminuer l'impact négatif de ces sanctions sur les droits de l'homme, tout en sachant que vous avez par exemple remis un rapport qui s'oppose à la criminalisation de détournement des sanctions. Nous savons que l'Union européenne a adopté une loi de criminalisation de tout ce qui constitue un détournement humanitaire de ces sanctions. Aussi, vous avez donné des recommandations de prendre en considération les groupes vulnérables comme les handicapés, les enfants malades, etc. Mais vos recommandations, ils ont resté dans les étagères. Est-ce que vous pensez que votre mission aujourd'hui est fiable devant ces sanctions unilatérales décidées sur des considérations politiques? Lorsqu'on se souvient que les États-Unis, par exemple, a décidé d'une façon unilatérale depuis 65 ans de faire un embargo sur la Cuba. Vous êtes aussi une ressortissante bélarusse, votre pays aussi, il est sous sanction. Aujourd'hui, même les universités sont les cibles de ces sanctions. Les universitaires même, ils n'ont pas le droit, les universitaires bélarusses, iraniens, cubains, Ils n'ont pas le droit de participer, de publier des articles, de contacter avec,
Is it just him who has lost the connection?
It looks like that. I have heard 4 questions.
I think we lost connection with him.
If I was correct.
Yeah, I don't know if you understand French even a little bit, but I can summarize.
Well, if I understand correctly, the question about the process of the responsibility for sanctions, the responsibility for sanctions to vulnerable groups, and the impact on vulnerable groups, on population in general, on academic area. So am I right?
Yeah, but he was asking more specifically about what are your views about the effectiveness of your mandate. That's really the question that he was asking, about your mandate and the recommendations that you have already made, which he was saying are being ignored, and when countries are imposing unilateral sanctions like on Cuba, on Belarus, and even the universities are being sanctioned, and so in that context, if you can say a few words.
It's still 4 questions because there is, unfortunately, there is no clear-cut answer, yes or no, in any of the questions and the question in general. Yeah. So the fact that unilateral sanctions are used today and they are enforced more and more effectively, and I would say more and more with the harder and harder tools, is a part of the reality what we face today. And unfortunately, it doesn't disappear in one moment. One of the instruments to try to struggle with this reality was establishment of the mandate. And well, it's need to tell the truth that having one person only in the whole world being in charge to have a look at what's happening with unilateral sanctions, assess their legality, assess humanitarian impact, and trying to change the world is really not much. And I would say that one person is not able to change the world immediately, especially taking into account that the person is working as an independent expert. So continuing to do as all other special rapporteurs, continuing to do the basic work back at home, working at the professor, and so on and so forth. At the same time, the fact that the mandate was established is already good, at least provides for the possibility to draw attention to the problem. And the way which I propose to go is to try to look for the assessment of the legality of one instrument or another. And what I see is a huge step forward for the solution of the problem. Naturally, it will not come today or tomorrow. It's a long-term strategy. The good point is that states stop to deal with sanctions in the political sphere only. It's not the discussion whether in black and white terms. That's already a discussion about legality, about the factual impacts, and what to do to minimize the impact, and what to do to withdraw and to lift unilateral sanctions, so to make states to lift these sanctions. And this shift to the assessment of legality I see as being very important, because we see now there are several cases at the International Court of Justice on sanctions issues. It has never been before. That means states started to try to use adjudication and legal mechanisms. If we look even at the rhetoric of the countries which impose sanctions, we'll give a clear-cut case of Russia, when there are multiple states announcing that we need to seize the assets of Russia. And then it said, but we need to find a legal ground. And this discussion lasts for 2 years already, because everyone has now accepted the point that you shall be in capability to justify what you are doing from the point of law. Many things are not justified, but still the approach is changing. States which are under sanctions start to use the judicial means and the legal means more and more, and states which impose sanctions feel uncomfortable. Yet there is an attempt to say we do not need legal ground, it's a part of our foreign policy, but at the same time they feel uncomfortable with that. Second part of my strategy as a mandate holder was to show real facts. the reports on the country visits reveal the factual consequences of the ground. So before I went to Venezuela, for example, the discussion was, well, that's a wrong government which is behaving in a wrong way. That's why human rights are affected. And in my report, I managed to demonstrate the clear-cut connectivity between the sanctions imposed since the moment when I imposed with specific human rights suffering. So it's not possible to blame shame on the government only. And my position is that states are not, which are using the rhetoric of human rights to impose unilateral sanctions, basically try to forget that they are also under the responsibility to make sure that the activity, especially activity of extraterritorial nature, doesn't affect human rights abroad. That's why they start to change the rhetoric. They start to speak about the unintended consequences, although I'm not sure. And from the point of law, it doesn't matter when they were intended or unintended, they exist. And therefore, states are under obligation to do all necessary steps to prevent these negative consequences from happening. So if they didn't do it, they are already in breach of their international obligations, even if, as they pretend, the consequences are unintentional. So therefore, indeed, we have the broad scope of unilateral sanctions now, means of the enforcement, and unfortunately growing or compliant. But at the same time, I strongly believe that as soon as the assessment of legality takes place, as soon as international institutions are used, it will be easier to change the situation. It doesn't happen in one day naturally. Similarly, for example, I believe that one person, one mandate holder, is not the sufficient tool to change everything. Other institutions shall be involved. And that's why, for example, the development of the monitoring platform is the means to involve of all the UN institutions to monitor the humanitarian impact of sanctions. And if it happens, that means that it will be the whole United Nations involved in the process of assessment of legality, of the issues of establishment of the facts, and naturally it will already be the authority of the all UN organizations. It goes slowly, but I see some positive steps in this sphere.
If we, speaking of facts, if we dive a little bit into the effects of these sanctions, and if we take some of the examples that you have seen with your own eyes in, for example, Iran, Syria, or Russia, from your observations and reports, what are the most pressing humanitarian issues that arise from these unilateral coercive measures in these countries that you have studied?
Well, first of all, it's necessary to mention that the impact is different in any country, and it depends on the sustainability of the country in this specific area. Like, for example, if you have seen my recent end of mission statement on the country visit to China, China also faces negative humanitarian impact, but take into account that it's huge, very stable economically, develops well economically. It was able to mitigate many of the impact, although not to eliminate them fully. So the end of mission statement reflects, for example, on the serious impacts in the sphere of economic and labor rights, and in the sphere of the education and the academic exchange. However, for many countries, the impact might turn to be really devastating. And I would refer as the most terrible situation to the situations of Syria and Venezuela and Zimbabwe. Although Zimbabwe is under the minimum scope of sanctions. Situation in Iraq is also, situation in Iran is also not good, but Iran was able to keep many processes ongoing. So in general, the first sphere which is affected is the sphere of economy. That means if economy is affected, on the first ground, the rights of people in the economic area are affected as well. So we are talking about the economic and social rights. People lose jobs. If they lose jobs, they do not have money to cover their living expenses. Might be they are paid less. So in the countries like Syria, Venezuela, or Zimbabwe, I have been reported that the salary dropped like 100 times. Like in Zimbabwe, average salary of $500, $700 changed to be $2 to $10 per month. with the food basket cost being around $200. So basically, people do not even earn the basic food, and they survive only due to the food baskets given to them by the government to support their life, and due to the engagement in the gray economy. So all types of economic rights also include, for example, the right to food and right to health. So if you do not have money, you are not able to cover your health expenses as well. If the state is not getting sufficient revenue, it's not able to continue to support the proper functioning of the health system as well. So therefore, access to health is also affected, and especially affected for the vulnerable groups. I mean, for the people with disabilities or for the people suffering from rare and severe diseases. And this effect exists due to a number of reasons. The first one is naturally the fact that quite often governments become not so much able to provide this necessary medical treatment and medicine free of charge as it usually used to do, as I was reported in Syria, in Iran, and Venezuela, and in Zimbabwe. The second part is that if people do not have food, they quite often might still receive the medicine from the government free of charge, but they try to sell it at the black market to buy some food. Therefore, they do not get necessary medicine because they refuse having that. But there is another problem. Quite often it's not necessary to procure this medicine even for the government, because despite the existence of so-called humanitarian exceptions, they are not effective. So formally you can say, yes, you can buy medicine and food, but you are not allowed to deliver, you are not allowed to pay. No pharmaceutical company will ever give you medicine free of charge, and you are not allowed to insure. So at the very end, the companies refuse to sell anything, and even if you manage to get something, you will get a really reduced scope of that. I sent several communications referring to the impossibility to get access to medicine, medical equipment, as well as, for example, software for medical equipment, because you cannot function that, or spare parts, or, for example, the adaptive equipment for the people with disabilities. They need to keep the normal quality of life. So as a result, for people, and usually when we talk about people suffering from rare or severe diseases, as soon as there are not many of them worldwide, it's not necessary to have a factory in every state. That means that you might have 1 or 2 producers all around the world, and quite often these 1 or 2 producers are based in the sanctioning countries. So they refuse to sell, and for the people, the mortality rates are skyrocketing immediately. One of the communications I sent was about thalassemia patients in Iran. And due to the unavailability of this medicine for 2 years, the mortality rate changed from 25-30 per year, as they used to have, with 33,000 of these patients in Iran, up to 260, 2080. So it's 8-time multiplication of the mortality rates. Similarly, the life expectancy is reduced a lot, and naturally the quality of their life is changing. And I need to mention that it's only one example. In reality, there are many rare and severe diseases worldwide, and quite often there is only 1 or 2 producers for them. And even for the known diseases, like for example, diabetes, we all are aware that diabetes is treated with insulin, but there are different types of diabetes. And if a majority of people dependent on insulin, just the regular format of insulin is fine, for around 5% it's not. They need specific forms. And usually for this category of people, again, there is like a monopolist producer or 2 monopolist producers worldwide, and there are challenges to deliver that. So we are talking about thousands of different diseases or thousands of different forms of specific diseases. And these people, for them, it's the life and death issue. As concerns the overall situation, when we talk about not specific sanctions, but we talk about sanctions, enforcement of sanctions, and over compliance with sanctions, we end up in the fact that all that combined together is affecting the whole population of the country. So as a result, it's not vulnerable groups only. It's all people of the country being affected in one way or another, starting from the simple forms. Well, we'll cite my own one, because I'm usually asked what is the impact of sanctions we do not understand in the everyday life. For people, I'm Belarusian, so I come from the country under sanctions, and the special rapporteur need to travel a lot. So the simplest impact for the whole population in the country, that it's not possible to travel directly any longer to Europe, for example, or to many other countries. So my trip to Geneva changed from 3 hours direct flight, which used to function every day, to the need to fly via Istanbul or Dubai, then to change probably in Frankfurt or Amsterdam or somewhere else. So sometimes it might be 30 hours of traveling, which is much longer, much more expensive, with challenges to change and so on and so forth. So, and that's not only my example, that's for every national of the country due to the sanctions imposed on the travel company. I have been reported absolutely the same stories as concerns other countries under sanctions, where the transportation means either the mostly the air companies were under sanctions. Similar case is if the financial sanctions are imposed, you cannot transfer money anyway. Any citizens of the country cannot receive money or cannot transfer money. The Hawala system used in some countries provide only to get for the possibility to get the minor revenue from the relatives abroad, and it's not always functioning properly. Moreover, it's very much criticized everywhere. Then the other problem comes about the simplest businesses which used to be dependent on international relations. I do not talk about interpreters or diplomats only, although they are affected a lot. I talk about the businesses which used to export something, about tourism businesses, about hotel businesses, about transportation inside, which used to support the functioning of the tourist industry. It's not possible to book a hotel abroad. It's not possible to book the plane quite often. Sometimes it comes to ridiculous cases. Again, we'll cite my own one. I contributed to the book about sanctions published in the UK. And then the publisher contacted me and said that you are resident in Minsk, so we are not able to send you your own copy of the book. And as a result, I had to ask to send it to a friend of mine in Geneva to be able to receive it. But that same story, as it was asked by your colleague, international cooperation in cultural, art, sport, academic, any other types is affected. It's not possible for people to come to the conferences to have a dialogue. And I always advocate for the dialogue. If we do not have a dialogue, we cannot find the solution. So many people are prevented to get access to online databases. And if it sounds not to be scary, I will give you a scary example on the case. I recently sent a communication about that, and there was a press release released like a little bit more than a week ago. It's not sometimes possible to get access to UN web pages from the countries under sanctions. One of the most scary examples refers to Syria. Syria used to be in the course of the military conflict for a long period of time. And for the cases like that, naturally, in every military conflict, there is a violence towards each other, towards children, towards women. And UN has launched the system to report about sexual violence in the military conflict. So it's naturally a tool which can be actively used in Syria. But Syrians are not able to use this tool, because as soon as they press the button to submit information, they got the response with your IP address. You cannot use the tool. So people who are basically affected by this situation, for whom this tool has been established, are not able to use it because the platform provider is not the UN, basically. It's the subsidiary company recruited by the UN, and quite often registered in or dependent on the jurisdiction of a state which imposes sanctions, so therefore they limit the accessibility of the problem. Well, eventually, to sum up everything what I have said, I can hardly identify any type of civil, economic, social, cultural rights, or the right to development, or any SDG, which is not affected by the use of unilateral sanctions.
So one other indirect consequence of sanctions maybe, and I'd like to get your view on this, is because you mentioned the gray market. From your experience and from your research, do you see a correlation between corruption in sanctioned countries? I mean, sanctions promoting and encouraging corruption in those countries, in those societies? Because this is something that is often evoked.
Well, here again, before I will give you an example, it's necessary to say that it's definitely not the case that unilateral sanctions is the only reason of corruption. But
Sure.
It gives another layer for corruption. We'll give you an example of Zimbabwe. One of the official reasons announced to impose sanctions on Zimbabwe was the fact that they referred to the corruption in Zimbabwe. Zimbabwe started to take steps to struggle corruption in accordance with the Convention Against Corruption. But what's happening at the very end, if you are not able, when they started to take these steps, it appeared that sanctions prevent these steps from being taken incredibly. So at any stages, when we are talking about corruption, you shall be able to investigate cases of corruption, first of all. To be able to investigate, you need to have human resources, you need to have proper forensic expertise, you need to have the possibility to do the all due process investigation and the judicial consideration of the case. But as soon as the sanctions are imposed, again, the sanctions, like in Zimbabwe, they have more than 50% of vacancies in judicial sector and in the police sector. So the simple case, you do not have people to do the proper investigation. If you are not able to procure for proper functioning on transportation, you cannot even bring people and businesses to the courts, so simplest elements. And therefore, the investigation process is undermined as such. I do not even mention forensic expertise because many elements, the equipment or, for example, reagents necessary to do that, or the people who are able to do a forensic expertise of online transactions is very problematic. You do not have people, you do not have equipment, you do not have spare parts. So investigation of corruption crimes becomes much more complicated. The second part, however, is even more complicated. What I could establish, and it's much broader than corruption, as soon as the country falls into economic crisis, so people do not have money, they are not able to earn their living, people start to move to gray economy. Like in Venezuela, 46% of people are involved into gray economy. Some of them start to engage in criminal schemes. If there is a choice, either you have some food today and commit a crime, or you do not have food today and you die due to hunger. And if you do not commit a crime, many people prefer to commit a crime. So therefore, and I reported that even, for example, at the ARIA formula meeting at the UN Security Council. So the use of unilateral sanctions and complexities caused by unilateral sanctions give rise to all types of transboundary crimes, from corruption and illicit trafficking in arms, the cultural objects, up to the trafficking in human, arms trafficking, and the international terrorism as such. So therefore, naturally, if people are desperate, if you have shortage of goods, it always is a condition conducive for corruption, conducive to any types of crimes. Element number 3, traditionally, when sanctions start to be imposed, the countries start to face challenges to pay, to receive payments, and to sell goods at certain markets. So if you are not able to sell goods or to do a transfer via open channels, and you need to involve some sort of alternative means, some sort of mediators, the level of corruption is immediately increasing. So the risks for corruption are immediately increasing, if not for the government itself, but might be for someone else, being a part of this money transfer or trade scheme. So unfortunately, and the fourth element is that unfortunately the reference to corruption is used as a ground to impose sanctions, which from the point of international law has nothing to do with the real state of law. Convention Against Corruption clearly prescribes that states are obliged to take measures domestically to prevent corruption from happening, and only the state on the territory of which the crime of corruption took place have jurisdiction to investigate the case. Let's say if money are transferred to another country, then this another country starts to get the jurisdiction on the case. But it cannot be the case when, for example, I would cite Venezuela case, US said that we are so much concerned about corruption taking place in Venezuela, so that we impose sanctions because we believe that corruption is the most terrible crime. It's not. We have a convention against corruption, which has been signed and ratified by many states. We have a convention on suppression of transboundary crimes. We shall behave in accordance with international treaties states have already accepted as being obligatory for them.
So you have made it clear how sanctions can have a large and diverse sort of negative effects on vulnerable people and all sorts of people. I also wonder, based on historical and current examples, have sanctions, whether unilateral or multilateral, have they ever managed to achieve their desired results without causing significant humanitarian distress? Do we have any counterexample?
It's a very complicated question. To tell the truth, take into account that my mandate is already extremely broad. I try not to go to the elements whether the objective was achieved or not, because as a lawyer, I strongly believe that if you use illegal means, you shall stop doing that. Regardless, the good purpose you announce, saying like it's for common goods or for higher values, that's just a rhetoric. It's not about law. So therefore, whatever your good purpose might be announced, you are not allowed to use illegal means. Use the legal means for the good purpose, otherwise it's illegal. However, I would cite a few examples from the practice of the UN Security Council when sanctions were legal. We all, I guess, are aware about the fact that the UN Security Council in this situation, when it qualifies the situation or the act as a breach of peace, threat to peace, or an act of aggression, can impose sanctions, including military measures. It used it very actively in the comprehensive way in 1990s and early 2000s. We can cite cases of Iraq. We can cite cases of Somalia, of Rwanda, and many other cases. And eventually, there was a huge study done with the United Nations about the efficacy of the UN Security Council, adopted in 1990s, 2005. And unfortunately, in the majority of these cases, the efficacy was either low or didn't exist. In some cases, it was effective when in the situations when it was a recognized case of genocide, the level of, let's say, hostilities was reduced, but it mostly involved some sort of serious measures, but there were just few cases of that. At the same case, the most known case is the humanitarian consequences to Iraq. After the UN Security Council has imposed comprehensive sanctions on Iraq, in a certain period of time, the humanitarian organizations, together with OCHA within the UN, presented a report. And the report was so scary it clearly demonstrated figures of humanitarian impact. Again, these measures were legal. So it has happened that the additional mortality of children under 5 within 10 years. So we have a regular mortality rates of children under 5 years, additional mortality within 10 years was upon different calculations from 450,000 up to 860,000. That is additional mortality. So that basically means that every year, additional 45 to 85,000 children beyond 5 were dying due to the impact of sanctions only. Then there were reports about the impacts on education, on distribution of cholera, impossibility of vaccination, economic rights, the access to food, access to health, and many other. And the UN Security Council changed the approach afterwards. So today, if you look at the mechanisms used by the UN Security Council, we do not have any single comprehensive sanctions regimes of the UN Security Council. The UN Security Council tries to be really targeted in the measures imposed. Moreover, for every sanctions regimes, it established a huge sanctions expert panel and sanctions committee which monitors the impact. Plus, it did its best to develop the exceptions mechanism. Although it still recognizes that serious humanitarian impacts exist, that's why it launched it adopted Resolution 2664, which provides for the possibility to deliver humanitarian assistance and tries to protect humanitarian workers. I believe it's not enough because these measures quite often are blocked by unilateral sanctions. And I have received multiple reports from humanitarian organizations when they take this resolution, they take the acts adopted by states saying, yes, we shall implement it, go to the bank and banks say we do not care because unilateral sanctions prevent from any transactions. So that's another problem, but at least when we talk about the UN Security Council changed the approach. What we are observing today is that, first of all, unilateral sanctions are mostly legal. So these states are applying illegal measures, which being very broad, we have several countries with overlapping sanctions regimes being very uncertain, very vague, affecting financial system sectors of economy, country in general, education, work, anything else. And altogether with over-compliance by businesses due to the risk of higher penalty for circumvention of sanctions regime, we end up in establishment of comprehensive sanctions regimes to the country under sanctions. We'll just give you an example of Zimbabwe. No sanctions against Zimbabwe in reality exists. So formally, European Union, 0 cases, UK, 5 individuals, US, 70 plus individuals and 20 plus companies. But take into account that US has designated the highest state officials, as well as the companies designated are those which used to provide the main revenue. And the lists are changing all the time. Due to over-compliance, the sanctions faces the country faces the consequences equivalent to those being under full sanctions regime. So no sanctions against Zimbabwe, but in reality, the consequences are the same. That's why I undertook this initiative to develop the guiding principles on sanctions, business, and human rights to prevent it from happening.
Speaking of guiding principles, this makes me curious about something. If I understand correctly, in principle, any country can adopt sanctions, right? But do you notice a certain imbalance in their distribution, or certain regions of the world, groups or states more targeted than others?
Well, again, I always advocate that all states shall behave only within the scope of the rule of law. So it's not allowed to use unilateral coercive measures. So the use of sanctions which do not intend directly to implement strictly sanctions of the UN Security Council, which break international obligations of states, or which can be qualified countermeasures, and that is around 98–95% of unilateral sanctions imposed today, it's illegal. So nearly everything used today as unilateral sanctions is illegal. Therefore, when we talk about countries, let's say today, I believe we observe some even more dangerous processes, as many sanctions regimes imposed do not even try to refer to any fact of violation. They announce to be like a part of the foreign policy, or the means to keep the priority of the country in the specific area, like in high tech or somewhere else. So that's fully against not only the international obligations of states, but also, again, the recent documents adopted by the UN Secretary General, like the new agenda announced in 2023, or the new rule-based order announced by the UN Secretary General in 2021. So therefore, for any country around the world, it's illegal to take these measures. Some countries start now to take what they call counter sanctions. And formally, again, the majority of these measures taken within the scope of counter sanctions fall within the criteria of countermeasures. So lots of measures taken as counter sanctions might be legal. However, I always ask states who impose counter sanctions to be fit the criteria of countermeasures. But it's still this process of counter sanctions somewhere in the element of at the beginning of the process, and I hope that the legislation and the practice of its application will be drafted in the way fully corresponding the standards of counter sanctions, countermeasures. So in that case, they can do it. However, humanitarian impact exists.
Yeah. I think, Alena, you have traveled a lot, right? And I'm sure you have seen a huge number of a lot of negative effects of all these sanctions, and we have discussed a lot of them today. Perhaps you can tell us of some of the beautiful stories that you have seen, not only the negative impacts, but have you seen some beautiful stories of resilience, for example, that have been shown or that you have witnessed in these different countries?
Well, eventually the point of resilience is probably the most beautiful part of that. So what I could observe is that despite all the challenges people feel, they try still to look for something positive. It's very scary to see the negative impacts. It's very scary to listen when people are saying that we feel that hope is dying, that we feel that our new generation has no hope and we will get the generational gap. But at the same time, that was good to see that people still try to assist each other. They shall still try to keep the cultural identities. For example, when I did a country visit to Syria, which has electricity available per 1 or 2 hours in the countries, like when you enter to Damascus at night, everything is dark. You have just a few places with a little bit of electricity. But I was brought to one of the concerts at night in the church. We are organized and initiated by representatives of different religions. So you could see representatives, the heads of the representatives of different religions, sitting shoulder by shoulder with each other in this church, and people of different religions and confessions were playing classic music with fully dark Damascus around, just to show that they have this feeling of culture, that they are together, that they still remember that there is art in this life. And these people were not paid. It was just to demonstrate that they are alive and they still have hope. And the signs like that, I saw the tiny projects we'll give you an example of Syria with more than 500,000 street children. and they are abandoned. They are subjected to various sorts of violence, and there is no possibility to take care of them properly in the country. But I saw smaller NGOs. No one will ever learn about their names at the outside spectrum, but they were providing like shelters, taken out of streets like 30 children or 20 children, giving them the child's chance for normal life. And I also saw the resilience, very high level of resilience in many other countries. In Venezuela, when they were trying, neighbors were trying to support each other to allow themselves to survive. In Cuba as well. So therefore, I believe that resilience is a good part of this story, saying that people as human beings help each other to stay human beings and to demonstrate the example of humanity. So I hope very much that despite all the challenges with the relevance to the law and with relevance to the facts and acting in accordance with the principle of humanity, situation will start to change.
On that same topic, one of the things that struck me was during COVID, where suddenly Cuba, that I know very little bit about, but suddenly we hear about them sending doctors and nurses, medical staff to different countries that were struggling to handle the COVID crisis. And I found that really amazing for a country that's under sanction, especially when one considers the country that's imposing the unilateral sanctions on them, USA, their own management of the COVID crisis and how many issues that they had.
Indeed, unfortunately, in Cuba, there was another part of this story when Cuba was the only country which was not able to receive the donation sent by this Alibaba Foundation to 50 countries. So Cuba, and it was free of charge. So Cuba was the only one who was not able to receive it because all transportation, all ships which could deliver were under sanctions. And they refused to deliver all these protective masks and all the other elements to Cuba due to the fear of sanctions. So we talk about two parts of the story, unfortunately.
Thanks for both of you for sharing these stories with us. It's always mesmerizing to me how trials and suffering and difficulty, it also often seems to bring the best out of people. So that's a beautiful way of seeing it. Another question that I had in mind is you spoke about challenges and that you face in doing your work. We have seen recently the news about the group of US senators that have sent a letter to the International Criminal Court, Chief Prosecutors Karim Khan, and threatening him basically with repercussions if the court issued arrest warrants against Benjamin Netanyahu.
But he's already under sanctions. Decision is taken.
Is taken, right? And my question is this something that is common, this type of threats? And do you yourself have to face such pressures and obstacles in your own duty?
Well, I'm not under sanctions. That's what I need to say. And as concerned the imposing sanctions on ICC, I was one of the two leading mandates who sent communication the previous time when sanctions were imposed on the prosecutor and the judges of the ICC. As concerns myself, so again, I'm not under sanctions yet, but what I face terrible hate campaigns online. So they come from various sources. They might come from the regular media. They might come from social networks. And they are very varied, starting from the mere fact that of my Belarusian nationality. So there was a period when the most frequent question during interviews was, you are Belarusian, how can you prove that you are not biased? And I was always asking, what do you think about discrimination? I mean, discrimination on the ground of nationality is always condemned by the United Nations. On the fact that I'm still resident in Belarus and work for the public university is also used as like a clear-cut case of demonstration of me being biased. There was another campaign which has been launched during my country visit to Iran, and it still continues, which tries to prevent people from me reading my reports referring to the fact of me being bribed by countries. So I guess that the information about China and Russia being donors of the mandate is everywhere right now. And formally, unfortunately, there is no protection from that case, because eventually, yes, indeed, the mandate is supported by countries. I do not receive money. Human Rights Council receives money. And all this information about all money received, allocated, they are not even received, they are allocated for mandates within the Human Rights Council, is publicly available in yearly published report about special procedures. And report identified what money have been received by Human Rights Council and from what countries and allocated for what mandate. And therefore, what I can decide about the money is just how to use them. For example, I invite experts to come to participate in the expert consultations. Many of them are not able to pay, especially if they come from the countries under sanction. They are pretty poor. These money are used to pay for their traveling and to pay for their hotel when they come to Geneva for consultations. I used money to recruit extra people because I am entitled to have one staff assisting me only within Geneva under the resolution. Similarly, Sanctions research platform, its development and maintenance is covering from that money. Sanctions monitoring tool will also be paid for of that money. And therefore, however people telling this story, she received this amount of money from, is demonstrated as a clear case of me receiving the money and being a case of corruption. It's in Wikipedia as well. And the purpose is not to tell that I'm bad only. It's just the purpose is to prevent people from reading the report, to learn about the legal and factual challenges and their legal and factual impacts. However, the third part of the let's say attack I received was disclosing of personal data, not only of mine, but of my elderly parents or any other relatives. That part was pretty challenging, especially for my relatives, which definitely do not deserve to be subjected to the attack, as well as do not deserve to be seen as doing something wrong, although I'm not doing anything wrong as well.
Yeah, there is a complementary question that comes to mind when we speak about this subject, like corruption and all that. Perhaps it's a very naive question, but I'm sure a lot of people will resonate with that. When we see some countries threatening the ICC and international institutions and all that, whenever a decision is taken against them, one cannot help but think that or feel that international law is some sort of a joke, right? And it's like a facade. Countries pretend to obey international law when in reality they only obey as long as it is in their favor. And as soon as the law is against them, some countries, they start acting like gangster or even like a mafia. In your expert opinion, what is lacking in all these international structures and institutions to have a truly efficient international justice?
That's a very good question. To tell the truth, when I usually start my 4 semesters course of international public law for my student, that's the first question always asked. And indeed, international law is not always efficient. And international law is very different from the national law. Because in the national law, you have a clear-cut vertical structure of legislation, of law enforcement, and of monitoring. In international law, we talk about that as about horizontal structure. It's built upon the consent of the states. And quite often, it's pretty problematic to enforce that, especially when we are talking about the countries which can impose veto power and to prevent any measures from being taken. At the same time, international law is still effective. Yes, it's violated to a certain extent in specific situations. However, if we compare with the situation when international law didn't exist, we do not understand how much situation has changed. We open the news and we see a state A attacked a state B. And we are shocked. We all know that it's illegal. We all are against that. We all start to do something and think what shall be done. But if we talk about situation existing 100 years ago, no one cared. It was a normal path. State A attacked state B, B attacked C, C attacked A, and vice versa. So this part, the very fact that we started to think that attacking another state is bad, attacking or doing something using unilateral coercive measures is bad. 100 years ago, no one cared about that. The UN Charter, on the first hand, only limited the use of military force because all the rest was at that point considered not to be so urgent. So before we got the new system of the world legal order, no one cared either of the use of force or use of UCMs or whatever else. States were free to do that. So the very fact that we are concerned about that is the demonstration that international law changed our mentality. Not fully, it's not the ideal world. Secondly, international law is much broader than what we have only discussed now. We used to rely that you give you a clear example. You can book a ticket to any parts of the world and the companies will somehow cooperate, your luggage will be delivered, and you will travel normally and safely and you will be insured. That's another part of international law we accept for granted, but which is based on international law. The fact that we can send a letter and it will be delivered to any part of the world. It's not just because it came for granted. That's because the Berne Convention on international correspondence is functioning properly, and many other elements. So that's why I, as a law professor, I haven't lost hope and trust to international law. Although I'm a law professor I'm in this area for 24 years already. I haven't lost it yet. And I believe that, let's see, it's only international law plus the humanity which can help us to bring situation back to normal. We have what to discuss. We talk about the importance of the rule of law, importance to enforce law. When we talk about unilateral sanctions, what we observe now is that companies and people in the sanctioning countries start to be affected. And moreover, we'll give you an example on the reliance of international law. Recently, the main sanctioning actors like the European Union, UK, and US started to complain about counter-sanctions imposed by China. European Union and UK have issued documents, they are program documents, they are not like laws, called Chinese economic coercion, Chinese anti-Chinese economic coercion programs or whatever else. And some of US senators brought a bill, which is currently with the Congress, trying to qualify the use of Chinese counter-sanctions as political warfare. And all of them provide the reasoning. They say our sanctions are good. And what China is doing doesn't correspond criteria of countermeasures. It's illegal. And when I was reading the documents, I had the feeling that they forget about their own part. They ignore the fact of counter nature of these sanctions, of response by China. And I had a feeling that they opened my report 4 years ago and copied argumentation about illegality of UCMs to demonstrate that everything what is taken against them is also illegal. So basically, one of the elements of trust to international law is that everyone benefits when it's observed. So as soon as states start to be affected, they immediately recall the existence of international law. They say us, protect us, we want international law to protect us. I mean, in this situation, as concerned the anti-China coercion, economic coercion acts, it's ridiculous because they forget the part that China takes it in response to measures taken by this state. That's why it's fulfilled the most of criteria of countermeasures. But anyway, they also need it. So sanctioning countries also need international law to protect them. That's why I believe that is the only way to find the solution.
That's a good message of hope. Maurice, go ahead with your question.
Yeah. No, it's great to hear that you haven't lost hope after 24 years. For us, sometimes it's difficult. I mean, I understand the challenge. I understand the benefits of international law. I understand the challenges that the United Nations has to implement those. And you mentioned some of the positive aspects of international law, like the postal services, telecommunications in general, I think is another example. The fact that you can call just about any country in the world. One thing that often comes to my mind about these illegal unilateral sanctions is if there was a mechanism that would allow nations to do financial transactions without being sanctioned or without being blocked by these unilateral sanctions, that would have, I think, a positive effect. And I wonder because when USA left the JCPOA, the EU talked about setting up a mechanism that would kind of allow that to circumvent USA's sanctions and to be able to continue the agreement of the JCPOA between Iran and the EU. So my question is, could we not envisage the UN setting up some sort of structure that would allow nations to be able to do, free financial transactions amongst each other, free and legal financial transactions amongst each other? Could that not be a tool and a mechanism to help reduce the impact of unilateral illegal sanctions?
You asked very complicated questions. So first of all, I need to make a disclaimer. I'm not entitled to speak on behalf of the whole UN. I'm the independent expert entitled by the Human Rights Council, and I can speak only within the mandate which I have. Let's see, and the issues of the, let's see, operational and financial elements definitely fall outside of the scope of the mandate. But in general, that's like the international law in functioning. What I can observe, the UN is currently trying to establish even the UN Security Council within its humanitarian provisions of resolutions. It's not a state. It can only take the decision what states shall do. But for the rest, that shall be a cooperation between states. It's again, international law is based on the horizontal agreements. We do not have vertical enforcement. And even no organ within the UN can say, has the capacity under the Charter of the United Nations to say that we are establishing now totally new financial system. They have not received this authority from states. The UN is a result of authority of states deciding that we need UN. So therefore, when it comes to any other areas, and let's tell the truth, either financing or environmental protection or any other areas, states shall agree about the rules and states shall agree about the mechanism they establish. So I'm afraid we can hardly expect that the United Nations all of a sudden will solve all these problems just because it didn't receive this authority from the states to solve these problems. It shall be negotiations between states to find for this solution.
Wonderful. Let's wrap this up. I give you, Alena, the last word, maybe with a call to action. What message would you like to convey to policymakers, humanitarian organizations, the general public regarding the use and the impact of all these unilateral sanctions? What do you want to share as a message?
I believe that I would like to send several messages. The first message is to call for humanity. So when we are the impact of UCMs and our compliance with UCMs is undeniable. So message number one, please start reading reports. Facts are there. Ignoring them doesn't give us any solution. So message number two, people living in the country under sanctions and affected by these sanctions, they are the same people as anyone else. So it's non-discrimination. They deserve to have absolutely the same rights and to enjoy freedom from hunger, from poverty, to have access to medical assistance, and statements which exist sometimes that their suffering might be proportionate to our supreme goal is a clear discrimination. So I always call to think as a human being. These are other human beings, same as anyone else who are affected, suffering, dying because of that. And the last one is that in order to make sure that these first elements are introduced and human rights are protected, let's behave in accordance with the rule of law. That's a good solution. If states start to behave in accordance with the rule of law, the majority of humanitarian impact we observe now due to UCMs or UCMs related will just disappear, and my mandate will not be necessary. That will probably be the happiest part of the life or happiest event in the life.
Beautiful. Yeah, it's been already an hour. Beautiful. So it was a pleasure to have you with us, Alena. Thank you very much. I still have a lot of questions, but we will keep them for another occasion, perhaps. Anyway, thank you very much, Alena, for taking the time to share your expertise, and we wish you all the good for the rest of your work. Maurice, any last words?
Yeah. No, that you know, just to echo what Ridwan said, thank you very much for giving us the time. It would be really a pleasure and an honor also to meet you in person if you're ever in Geneva in any of your future trips.
I'm now in Geneva.
Oh, you are now in Geneva. So if you are in Geneva and if you have time, we had, I think, as you're aware, we had requested to do this in person rather than online, but maybe there'll be another opportunity to.
Well, eventually,
to
I mean, I
continue
said
the
that I was
discussion.
able to do it in person. Might be there was just a sort of the communication gap. So I didn't mind to do it in person. But in the future, I come to Geneva pretty frequently, would be happy to have another interview, as I understand it's possible to have many, many questions on the regards of UCMs, and we just cover it like the very general elements. So thank you very much for interest, and please send the link to the interviews when they are released. I usually try to copy all that on the webpage of the mandate to give more visibility, put it in the official tweet of the mandate, so to draw attention that people at least start to understand what's happening, because usually they do not understand.
Very good.
Sure.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you very much. Bye-bye.
Bye. Have a nice day.